Okay, so remember last summer, filling up the tank.
Yeah.
I mean, it was brutal. 6, $7 a gallon, depending where you were.
Oh, yeah. I bet some people are thinking back to the 70s, those gas lines.
Totally. And here's the thing, right? Even the head of the Federal Reserve, he's admitted he doesn't completely get how inflation works.
Hmm.
So if even he's a little lost, how are we supposed to figure it out?
Well, it's a question people have been struggling with for, decades, really. And that anxiety when you see prices going up in your savings, yeah, a lot of people feel that.
That's exactly why we're doing this whole deep dive today. We've got a bunch of articles, a really interesting NPR episode all about inflation here in the U.S. And we're going to break down how different presidents, different policies, they all tackled this, economic puzzle.
It's like a financial time machine. We're going back, starting with World War II, then Nixon's price freeze, all that craziness in the 70s, and right up to now, see what worked, what didn't, and, those unintended consequences that always pop up.
This isn't just a history lesson, though. If you remember the 70s, the 80s, the gas lines, the insane interest rates, this might actually help us understand what we're dealing with today.
Buckle up. We're about to time travel through inflation in America.
Let's start with World War II. 1940s, war efforts booming, factories are pumping out tanks, planes. But here at home, consumer goods, they're getting scarce.
Right. And you've got Roosevelt on the radio, those fireside chats, telling Americans to fight inflation just as hard as they're fighting the Axis.
He even called it, get this, the saboteur on the home front, really trying to rally the country against rising prices.
To fight that saboteur, they created the Office of Price Administration, or OPA, their job. Control prices, stop inflation from going wild during the war.
Like economic generals, basically.
Yeah.
Setting price ceilings on everything. Milk, bread, nylons, cars.
Everything. Can you imagine? Nylons $1.25. That was the reality. They even limited how much a cup of coffee could cost. 5 cents. They had huge price lists, sent them everywhere, and counted on everyday people to actually enforce them.
It's where the kitchen Gestapo comes in, right?
Exactly.
All these housewives volunteering to keep an eye on prices in their local stores, armed with their price lists and, I guess, a lot of determination.
It was amazing, really, the whole country coming together, supporting the war effort, keeping the economy stable. But it wasn't all smooth sailing.
I can imagine being a shopkeeper, trying to run a business with all these price controls, all these regulations.
Oh, absolutely. Not to mention the shortages. Prices are capped, demand goes up. You end up with long lines, empty shelves.
And of course, shortages mean black markets. People will always find a way, even if it means paying extra, under the table.
It shows you how tough it is to control something as complex as the economy. Fix one problem, you might create 2 more.
The OPA, though, they did keep inflation kind of stable during the war. But once it ended, the fight over price controls, that really heated up. Businesses hated them, said they were stifling growth, causing more harm than good.
And the meat industry in particular, in 46, they flexed their muscles.
How so?
They knew people were worried about food shortages, so they purposely held back meat, created artificial shortages.
Like holding steaks hostage?
Pretty much. It was a power move, plain and simple. Pressure the government, get rid of those price controls.
And it worked.
It did. Public opinion turned against the OPA. Republicans won the 46 midterms. Their whole campaign was, had enough. Price controls were gone, inflation spiked. Especially for meat, of course.
So that was the end of America's experiment with large-scale price controls. But as we'll see, the battle against inflation, it was far from over. Fast forward to 71, and we have another president wrestling with this economic beast, a president who built his career on being against government intervention, especially price controls, Richard Nixon.
It's wild, right? It really is, Nixon, the staunch conservative, built his whole career on bashing government intervention, especially price controls. And then what does he do?
Yeah, embraces the very thing he campaigned against. It's like a political 180.
Totally. It's like something out of a movie, right? Sunday night, August 71, you're sitting down, about to watch Bonanza.
And bam, Nixon's on your screen. Special news bulletin.
Talk about an interruption. And what's he announcing? A 90-day freeze on all prices, wages, everything, across the entire U.S.
What a shocker. I bet people were thinking, did I accidentally change the channel? But seriously, what made him do it?
The economy was a mess, inflation climbing, gas prices skyrocketing, those long lines at the pumps.
Oh, yeah.
People were getting antsy. Nixon had to do something, even if it meant going against everything he believed in.
But there's a key difference, right? Between this and what Roosevelt did, no rationing.
Huge difference.
Yeah.
Without rationing, People just hoarded stuff, made the shortages even worse. It was like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg.
Not very effective, to put it mildly. Plus, you had Vietnam, Watergate brewing in the background. Trust in the government was already shaky.
The perfect storm, Nixon's price controls, total flop, made people even more skeptical that the government could handle the economy.
And this brings us to the 70s. Economic chaos. I'm sure a lot of our listeners remember this all too well. Inflation going crazy, gas prices through the roof, a real sense of unease everywhere.
Stagflation, a horrible mix of high inflation and stagnant growth. Traditional solutions, they just weren't working.
So what happened? How do we get out of that mess?
Carter decided to shake things up. 79, he appoints Paul Volcker to head the Fed. Now, Volcker, he was known as a bit of an inflation hawk. Thought the Fed needed to take drastic action, even if it meant triggering a recession.
Wait, causing a recession on purpose?
Drastic, right. But he was convinced it was the only way. His weapon of choice, interest rates, he cranked them up to record levels, basically slamming the brakes on the economy.
This is the Volcker shock, right?
The one and only. Interest rates hit 20%, highest in U.S. history. It was painful. Businesses struggled, unemployment shot up, people were furious.
I can imagine. They wanted him to back down.
Oh, yeah. But Volcker held firm. He knew short-term pain was the only way to fix things long-term. And you know what? He was right. Inflation was at a crazy 13.5% in 1980. 3 years later, down to 3.2%.
So Volcker, the hero who slayed inflation.
He played a huge role, for sure, but it wasn't without consequences. The recession he caused helped pave the way for Reagan's election in '80.
Morning in America. Reagan promised economic revival, prosperity.
Yeah, he was all about free markets, deregulation, tax cuts. His policies, plus what Volcker had done, they led to this period of growth, relatively stable prices.
It's funny how those two approaches, government intervention with Volcker, then free market stuff with Reagan, they actually kind of work together.
It's a reminder that economics is never simple. There's no one answer. What works in one situation might not work in another.
And speaking of complex situations, let's move on to Greenspan. Alan Greenspan, big believer in free markets. He became Fed chairman in '87. And he oversaw this period of amazing growth, low inflation, the Goldilocks economy. Everything seemed perfect. Low unemployment, steady growth, inflation was tame. Greenspan was like the wizard, the maestro of the economy.
There was definitely a lot of, well, maybe a little too much optimism. Looking back, there were problems brewing, globalization, tech changing everything, deregulation. It all shifted the economic landscape. The old models, they didn't quite capture it all.
And then, bam, 2008, the financial crisis. Housing bubble bursts, credit markets freeze up, and the whole global economy. It's teetering on the edge.
A stark reminder that even with all our fancy models, powerful central banks, things can still go haywire.
Remember those headlines? Banks getting bailed out. It felt like the world was ending.
To stop a total meltdown, the Fed did things no one had ever seen before. Interest rates near zero, pumping trillions of dollars into the system.
Huge gamble. Desperate to save the economy, avoid another Great Depression.
It did work, in a sense, averted total disaster. But it also started this huge debate. What's the Fed's role, really? What happens when you take such drastic measures? What are the long-term effects?
Some people said it was necessary. Others worried about runaway inflation down the road.
And for a while, it seemed like those worries were for nothing. Inflation stayed low for over a decade. Even with all that money pumped into the economy, economists called it the Great Silence.
The old rules didn't seem to apply anymore. Low rates, growth, no inflation. It was baffling.
It really challenged the way people thought about economics. Policymakers wondered if they'd found some new secret formula for growth.
But, economic cycles,
Yeah.
they have a way of coming back around.
All right.
And fast forward to 2022.
Inflation's back with a vengeance. 40-year high.
All those quiet worries about runaway inflation, they became a chorus of panic.
And it's important to remember this wasn't all the Fed's fault. The pandemic, supply chains messed up, the war in Ukraine.
It was a perfect storm, everything hitting at once. Prices soared, and that economic anxiety, everyone felt it.
It showed the limits of relying only on the Fed, monetary policy alone, in this complex, interconnected world. It's not enough.
So after this journey,
Yeah.
World War II, rationing, the Volcker shock, the Great Silence, what have we learned?
Well, I think the biggest lesson is that inflation, it's a constant challenge, always there, but it changes, takes on different forms, no easy fix. And what worked before might not work now in this globalized economy.
The Fed's role, too. It's grown so much. They're seen as the solution to everything, but they're not all powerful.
Right. Too much reliance on them can be dangerous. We need other tools, other approaches, especially for these big, messy problems we face today.
So where do we go from here?
That's the big question, right? Inflation is back. It's in the headlines. Time to rethink some things. How does the economy really work? What should the government's role be?
We just scratched the surface today, but hopefully it's given everyone some things to think about. We've got the link to that NPR episode in the show notes. Check it out, dig a little deeper, and use these historical lessons to help you navigate your own finances.
History might not repeat, but it often rhymes. Understanding the past helps us understand the present and maybe even get a glimpse of the future.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into inflation. Back next week with a brand new topic. Until then, stay curious, keep learning, and remember, the only constant in economics is change.
And inflation.